What's going on, everybody? I think we're live. And why not? Together. We missed this hearing on the 11th, just a few days ago, so it's not irrelevant. Wait for some people to come on in, or just I'm going to start it because it's not going to start immediately. It's going to take about 30 seconds. It's a good one. High risk research. Don't know how I missed it. It was either at the same time as another committee hearing on the House side, or I just missed it. I gotta pump up my volume here. There we go. Should be gaveling in quite soon. What's going on, everybody? Good morning, good morning, good morning. Oh, you know what? Did I? Yes. Good morning. Misspelled. Close enough.
Committee will now come to order. Last month, this committee held a hearing on the origins of
That loud is loud for you guys as it is for me.
This came as part of a bipartisan security and life science research investigation that I am conducting with Ranking Member Paul. In that discussion, our expert witnesses raised the need for robust oversight of a wide range of high-risk life sciences research, both here in the United States and abroad. And this is the focus of today's hearing. Life science research can be critical to protecting public health and our national security. It helps us develop vaccines, improve our diagnostic tests, and sharpen our understanding of potential biological threats. If we're to face the health and security challenges of the 21st century, we will absolutely need to draw on high-risk research. At the same time, this research can be incredibly dangerous. It puts scientists in contact with harmful pathogens, and they sometimes do not get the necessary training on how to handle them properly. If equipment fails or researchers make an innocent mistake, it can carry serious health risk for the broader public. And the dangers are not just about physical materials. This work often includes sensitive information, which can have devastating consequences if it falls into the wrong hands. In short, we have to strike a delicate balance between fostering scientific progress and minimizing potential harms. Today's hearing will examine how well we are striking that very important balance, and if our policies provide enough transparency to Congress and to the American public. The debate on how to properly regulate life sciences research is not new, nor is it easy to resolve. Scientists and policymakers will have to wrestle with these questions for decades. The debate goes back at least as far as the 1970s, when scientists discovered that DNA from different organisms could be combined together in a lab to create a pathogen not found in nature. When they realized the potential ramifications of this discovery, they agreed to pause such research until the risks and benefits could be thoroughly assessed. Since then, experts have wrestled with other ethical issues in life science research, from cloning to stem cell research to modifying viruses. These questions are more important than ever. We are living in a remarkable age of technological change and scientific progress. Laboratories are springing up all over the world. Research areas are expanding, and money is pouring into this work from governments as well as private funders. We have a responsibility to harness the energy and ingenuity of this moment. It will allow us to identify new vaccines, new treatments, and better tests for novel pathogens. New technologies will help us do research faster, safer, by modernizing lab experiments and getting more information from smaller quantities of pathogens.
Was the next line in the
To be clear, this is an era of new research, and there will be risk, and we have to protect the American public against those risks. But we also have to be smart and strategic as we do it. Setting reactionary limits on federal research could have harmful consequences. Other countries could make crucial discoveries while our researchers are slowed down by red tape. Private donors could keep funding research without proper guardrails in place. We need to make sure that we maintain control of high-risk research to ensure that it's effective, innovative, and most importantly, safe. Science is an inherently human endeavor, and the question of what is too risky ultimately comes down to human judgment. There is no simple answer, but today's hearing and our panel of expert witnesses represent one important step in that work. They will help us understand what transparency and oversight policies exist today for high-risk science research, and what Congress should do to improve these measures and keep the American people safe. And I thank them for being here today, and I look forward to a robust discussion on this very important topic. I'd now like to recognize Ranking Member Paul for his opening remarks.
Since 2020, American families, communities, and businesses have borne the devastating consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Lives were unnecessarily lost, civil liberties were unilaterally stripped away by government bureaucrats. Taxpayers will carry the burden of the trillions of dollars borrowed and spent by the government for decades and generations to come. From the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Dr. Fauci and others within our government orchestrated a concerted effort to stifle any debate over the virus's origins. They coordinated the now debunked proximal origins paper, despite acknowledging privately that the virus looked engineered. The purpose of this vast cover-up, it now seems, was to conceal the dangerous biological research NIH and other government agencies were funding, both abroad and here at home. Over the last 4 years, compelling evidence has emerged supporting the lab origin of the pandemic and unraveling a web of deception, the vast COVID cover-up. We learned that the NIH funneled federal dollars through EcoHealth Alliance to support gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, research that may have caused the pandemic. We learned that multiple federal agencies sent taxpayer funds to China's Academy of Military Medical Sciences supporting PLA research. Most recently, the Department of Defense Inspector General found that the DoD is unable to fully account for the money that is sent to labs in China because the DoD does not track funding it sends abroad for pathogen research. So what has been done since the uncovering that our government was funding dangerous virus research overseas with little or no oversight? The answer is stark and chilling: virtually nothing. Some prefer this inaction, finding comfort in the shadows of bureaucracy and secrecy. They want Congress to remain passive, to accept their reassurances without question. We've fixed it. The problem's done. Nothing to see here. But we cannot stand idly by. We must demand accountability, strive for transparency, and ensure the safety of our citizens is never again compromised by negligence or deceit. You don't need to be convinced that COVID-19 virus originated from a lab leak to recognize the imminent need for oversight mechanisms. The mere possibility that the virus could have emerged from such risky research should be more than enough to prompt decisive action. How can we trust in a system that so blatantly ignores its own safeguards? How can we believe in leadership that permits such dangerous research without conducting stringent oversight, risking global health for the sake of dubious scientific advancement? This is not merely a failure, it's a betrayal of public trust. We sit here today at a critical juncture, facing what many believe is the nuclear threat of our time. Gain-of-function research, manipulating viruses to make them more lethal, poses a danger akin to that of an atomic bomb. In this dystopian reality we find ourselves in, it is our duty to challenge the status quo, to shine a light on the darkest corners of government operations, and to protect the freedoms and lives of the people we serve. The era of complacency must end, and change must begin with us. We must demand accountability for the grave oversights that were revealed by the COVID-19 pandemic. The safety of our nation and the trust of its institutions depends on it. This is why yesterday I introduced the Risky Research Review Act to codify an independent oversight of dangerous scientific research funded by the federal government. My bill would establish an independent board within the executive branch to oversee federal funding for high-risk life sciences research, ensuring the protection of public health, safety, and national security. The board would be comprised of non-government scientific and national security experts who would have the responsibility of reviewing and approving high-risk life sciences research proposals prior to the release of federal funds. The bill would also implement mechanisms to ensure accountability from agencies and applicants applying for federal funds to conduct high-risk research. My bill not only strengthens transparency, but also ensures that public health decisions are made in the best interests of the American people, free from financial motives and prioritizing national security. The Risky Research Review Act is endorsed by stakeholder groups and distinguished scientists, including the former director of the Centers for Disease Control is here with us today, Dr. Robert Redfield. According to Dr. Redfield, if the Risky Research Review Act had been in place, it might have prevented the COVID-19 pandemic. I urge the chairman and other members of this committee to support the legislation, which will begin to restore trust in science, our scientific community, and faith in our government institutions. Together, we can prioritize the national security of Americans, ensuring that we never again face such a preventable devastation.
Dr. Paul does not read
is
notes
the
unless he
practice of
needs
this
to
committee
be reminded
to
of
swear in witnesses.
something.
So if
It's
each
something.
of you would please stand and raise
I wonder if he
your
practices
right.
it or he's just in the moment. I
You
wonder
swear
what
that
his
the
process
testimony that you
is.
will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Thank you. You may be seated.
And I'm here for the Dr. Redfield.
Our
I mean,
first,
all of it.
witness
Dr.
is,
Redfield
Dr.
was the
Jerry
former
He
director of
is
the
Associate
CDC.
Dean
I'll let him
for
introduce
Global One Health
everybody.
at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Texas A&M University. He also serves as the director of the Biosecurity and Pandemic Preparedness Policy Program at the Skrokoff Institute of International Affairs. Dr. Parker, good to have you here with us today. You are recognized for your opening comments.
Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify before you this morning. I'm also honored to be in the company of such great fellow witnesses today, and I'm also glad to be joined by my wife, Denise, and several colleagues. The views and opinions I offer are my own, but are informed by serving in career executive leadership positions in the military and the federal government. I have a series of recommendations in my written testimony. This includes an evaluation of the strengths and weaknesses of the new policy for oversight of dual-use research and concern and pathogens with enhanced pandemic potential, which I will call the DIRC-PEP policy. I will highlight just a few of the most important messages now. First, I truly want to register my support for the new DIRC-PEP policy, although its implementation will be complex. In short, it is a step forward in the right direction. It defines a more appropriate scope and gives thought to implementation direction that was lacking in the P3CO policy. It clarifies some ambiguities in the policies it replaces and gives more detailed guidance to everyone from laboratory PIs to the federal funding agencies. It also adopts some of the common sense recommendations from the 2023 INSAB report. That report was a product of over a year of engagement with the public and stakeholders across the scientific community. That said, there are still pieces missing which only Congress can fix. The policy's success depends heavily on the willing compliance with the spirit and letter of the policy. There is no legislative mandate or resources provided for implementation. Furthermore, the policy does little to cover non-federally funded research. Congress should mandate the full implementation of the White House DIRC-PEP policy by federal agencies through provision of authorities, appropriations, or reallocation of resources, meaning financial, personnel, and technical, and providing ongoing congressional oversight. My second recommendation is to establish a newly independent authority to consolidate security-related biosafety functions in a single entity with a dedicated mission. This is not a new idea, but the time has come to give it serious consideration. The primary imperative is to prevent misuse and serious accidents from especially dangerous research. Scientific innovation will also be impacted unless we take risk mitigation measures now to prevent this small subset of research from discrediting the entire life science research enterprise. Additional biosafety and biosecurity authorities are needed to rebuild public confidence and reestablish our international leadership and responsible stewardship of life sciences. The principles of oversight of independent from program funding and a clear point of accountability must be embodied in an entity with a dedicated mission. These are widely recognized as best practices for risk mitigation. Strengthening oversight is not intended to stop meritorious research that has a compelling justification with assurances that risk will be mitigated. Prudent oversight is intended to ensure the small subset of especially dangerous research has especially important benefits, and if so, that the research will be performed safely and securely. I believe an independent authority will benefit the research community by funding and being a home for neglected biosafety research and elevating the field of biosafety. It can support training and education for biosafety professionals and PIs, helping them navigate the patchwork of security-related biosafety requirements. This will complement and strengthen the safety and security culture needed to support the accelerating paces of advances in biotechnology. Again, I'm encouraged by the new policy, but Congress should consider closing its gaps and weaknesses. Bottom-up responsibility must be linked to prudent top-down oversight using the principles of trust but verify. I think we should all agree dangerous research that could potentially create pandemic-capable pathogens ought to be limited and regulated. In closing, I believe that your responsibility to take legislative action to strengthen biosafety and biosecurity with independent oversight is not a condemnation of the scientific system. On the contrary, both Congress and the executive branch must act in a nonpartisan manner to protect the integrity of the system. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. I look forward to answering any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. Our second witness is Dr. Carrie Wolnitz. She is the Senior Principal and Chair of the Health and Bioscience Innovation Policy Practice Group at Lewis Burke Associates, LLC. Prior to her current role, Dr. Wolnitz spent nearly a decade in public service. She led the inaugural Health and Life Sciences Division in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and serves as the Associate Director for Science Policy at NIH. Dr. Wolnitz, welcome. You may proceed with your opening comments.
Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, and members of the committee, it is an honor to speak with you today on the topic of oversight of publicly funded research on high-consequence viruses. My name is Carrie Wolnitz, and as mentioned, I'm a senior principal at Lewis Burke Associates, which is a small government relations firm specializing in research and higher education policy. I have a long history of development and engagement on biosecurity and biosafety policy and research oversight in my previous roles inside and outside of government, including federal service at the NIH and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I come before you today in a personal capacity and do not necessarily reflect the views of Lewis Burke, their clients, or other organizations with which I'm affiliated. I've provided more extensive written testimony for the record, but will briefly summarize the salient points. First, I want to note, as the chair did, that the policy conversation around mitigating the risk of research involving high-consequence pathogens is not new. For decades, the U.S. has been at the forefront of global conversations about how to create a research oversight system that reduces risk while maximizing the benefit of life science research. We've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't. In thinking about our research oversight system, it's important to understand the purpose and context of the policy foundation on which we are building. Central to this is recognizing that the landscape represents a mix of laws, regulations, policies, and guidelines based on the interrelated but distinct notions of biosafety and biosecurity. Collectively, while this policy framework may be imperfect and should continue to evolve with the science and current threat landscape, it arguably represents the most rigorous system of oversight of pathogen research in the world. In fact, the U.S. approach informs the approach of many other countries. In my written statement, I've expanded on the history, strengths, and weaknesses of existing policy. Second, over 20 years of policy debate, the central question hasn't really changed. How do we appropriately balance risk and benefit of high-consequence research where there's inherent uncertainty on both sides of the equation? We undertake scientific inquiry because there are questions about the world around us for which we have no answers. Nature's ability to surprise us feels infinite, which is why we're always vulnerable to the next emerging health threat. Even as we speak, H5N1 is rewriting the textbook of what we know about avian flu viruses, despite rigorous research investments. The riskiest experiments with dangerous pathogens are not taking place in the laboratory. They're happening in real time in the real world with viral evolution serving as the lead investigator. That means that when we ask scientific questions or perform experiments, we'll lack clarity about whether or when we will realize benefit from that research or if it will pose risks that outweigh those benefits. Well-meaning technical experts can, and experience teaches us will, disagree on the magnitude of benefit and risk. Moreover, there'll always be some level of subjectivity as to what constitutes an acceptable level risk relative to the benefit and vice versa. There are no easy or perfect answers, and we learn as we go, which is why our policies appropriately continue to evolve. Third, in considering policies to reduce risks of research, we mustn't lose sight of the risk of limiting innovation or creating rigid frameworks that aren't agile enough to respond to new and emerging threats. We've been having this policy discussion for 2 decades because it's always been clear that research on high-consequence pathogens is critical and necessary for developing the countermeasures needed to protect human, animal, and plant health. Simply put, if we make it too hard for scientists to conduct and communicate the findings of experiments that expand our knowledge of pathogens, we will be less prepared for the next emerging biological threat. It's very easy to become focused on the risk of doing the research and lose sight of the risk of not doing the research. Additionally, in an increasingly competitive global environment, we must consider how best to reduce safety and security vulnerabilities in a way that doesn't stifle American innovation or competitiveness. But there is more that can be done to strengthen the current system of oversight. The new OSTP policy for oversight of dual-use research is an important step forward. The details of implementation will be important, and resources are critical for training the broader swath of the scientific community who will be affected by the policy. There's more Congress can do to bolster the global approach to biosafety and biosecurity, which is currently primarily based on norms, guidelines, and professional practices, including encouraging adoption of performance-based international standards like ISO 35001 and developing a non-punitive safety reporting system for bioincidents akin to the ASIAS system used by the aviation industry. Finally, global health security and prevention of the next pandemic requires rigorous and sustained support of capabilities that allow us to rapidly respond to new and emerging threats by strengthening pathogen surveillance and early warning systems, adopting a One Health approach against zoonotic diseases, and investing in the research, development, and manufacturing capacity to meet the goals of the bold 100-day missions. All of these should stand on the principles of transparency, continued U.S. leadership in driving the most effective norms and standards for research oversight, and balancing risk reduction with the vital need for innovation and future security. Thank you for the opportunity to present these views, and I stand ready to discuss them further.
Thank you, Dr. Walnuts. I'd now recognize the ranking member to introduce the 2 remaining witnesses.
Dr. Robert R. Redfield, our first witness, is served as the 18th Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention during the Trump administration. As CDC Director, he oversaw the agency's response to COVID-19 pandemic at its inception. Prior to being named director, Dr. Redfield spent more than 20 years as a U.S. Army physician and medical researcher at Walter Reed. He served as the chief of the Department of Retroviral Research at Walter Reed and worked in virology, immunology, and other clinical research. Dr. Redfield co-founded the Institute of Human Virology at the University of Maryland School of Medicine and has over 200 publications to his name. He earned both his Bachelor of Science and Doctor of Medicine from Georgetown University. He has testified before Congress extensively, most recently before the House Select Subcommittee on Coronavirus Crisis. Dr. Redfield, welcome to the committee. You are now recognized for your statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, and the members of the committee. I'm pleased to testify today in strong support of this committee's important work and the proposed bill designated to provide much-needed enhanced oversight of U.S. taxpayer-funded high-risk viral research. From 2018 to 2021, I served as the 18th Director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. As CDC Director, I oversaw the agency's response to the COVID pandemic from the earliest days of its spread, and I served as a member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force. But probably more relevant is my 45 years in medicine. I've been focused on the study of viruses. I'm a virologist by training and practice. I spent more than 20 years as a U.S. Army physician in medical research at Walter Reed Army Institute Research, where I served as the chief of the Department of Retroviral Research and worked in virology, immunology, and clinical research at the forefront of the AIDS epidemic and other viral threats. In 1996, I co-founded the Institute of Human Virology at the University of Maryland, where I was the Director of Clinical Care and Research, and I also served as a tenured professor of medicine, microbiology, immunology, the chief of infectious disease, and the vice chair of medicine. After my time at CDC, I served as a senior public health advisor to Governor Hogan in the state of Maryland, and more recently, I'm currently serving as a senior visiting fellow for biosecurity and public health policy for the Heritage Foundation. The bill proposed today's hearing is a very important bill. As we witnessed during the events leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a significant disconnect between U.S.-funded biomedical research and our national security interest. In my view, biosecurity is our nation's greatest security threat. But most biomedical researchers don't consider it at all when making their research funding decisions. Unfortunately, I do believe COVID-19 was an example of this fact. During my time as CDC director, I had the opportunity to work closely with the National Security Council and key members like Matt Pottinger and Robert O'Brien. They understood the threat of infectious disease, and I understood the profound security implications. This bill, once operationalized, will help ensure that our national security implications are front and center at any final funding decision and approval. Sadly, this has not been the case in the past and currently does not impact biomedical research decisions. I believe that COVID-19 was a consequence of this disconnect. As COVID-19 spread across the world, there were two competing hypotheses about the origin of the virus that needed to be vigorously explored. The first hypothesis was the probability that COVID-19 infections in humans were the result of a spillover event from nature. This is a situation in which the virus naturally mutates and becomes transmissible from one species to another, in this case from bats to humans via an intermediate species. This is what happened previously with SARS and MERS and the earlier coronaviruses that emerged from bats and spread through an intermediate animal. It's important to note that 4 years later, I do not believe there's any meaningful evidence, only opinion, to support this hypothesis. The second hypothesis is the possibility that the virus evolved from the lab through gain-of-function research. This type of research is when scientists seek to increase transmissibility or pathogenicity of an organism in order to better understand the organism and prepare to develop countermeasures. Under this theory, the COVID-19 affected the general population after an accidental leak from a lab in China. From the earliest days of the pandemic, it was my view that both of these theories needed to be aggressively and thoroughly examined. Unfortunately, this didn't happen. Based on my initial analysis, I believed then, and I still believe today, that the COVID infections were the direct result of a biomedical research experiment and subsequent lab leak. Unfortunately, the potential national security consequences of conducting the research did not receive full consideration prior to the funding decisions to conduct such high-risk research. Understanding the origin of COVID remained critical for the future of scientific research, particularly as it affects the ongoing ethical debate of gain-of-function research. While some believe gain-of-function research is critical to get ahead of viruses and developing vaccines and countermeasures, in this case, I believe it had exact opposite effect on unleashing a new virus in the world without any means of stopping it, resulting in the deaths of millions of people and changing our nation's way of life more profound than if we had had a nuclear event. More importantly, COVID is not the last pandemic. I'm particularly concerned about bird flu, currently H5N1 pandemic in chicken and turkey and waterfowl, spreading more than 25 other mammals in the U.S. and most recently dairy cattle. In my opinion, we should call for a moratorium on gain-of-function research until we have a broader debate and come to consensus as a community the value of such research. This debate should not be limited just to the scientific community, and it's critical that the national security implications carry significant weight in making future funding decisions. If the decision is to do gain-of-function research, it must be determined how, where, to do it in a safe, responsible, and effective way that does not compromise our national biosecurity. The proposed legislation would be a critical step in trying to achieve this. Again, I want to thank Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, for inviting me here today to share my perspective, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Our next witness is Dr. Kevin M. Esvelt. Dr. Esvelt is an associate professor at MIT Media Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He serves as the director of the Sculpting Evolution Group, which invents new ways to study and influence the evolution of ecosystems, and has over 40 publications to his name. Prior to his current role, Dr. Esvelt invented phage-assisted continuous evolution, PACE, a synthetic ecosystem for rapidly evolving biomolecules. He also developed the cluster regular interspaced short palindromic repeats, that's a mouthful, also known as CRISPR, for genome engineering and regulation at the Weiss Institute. He was the first to discover that CRISPR-based gene drive systems could spread from a handful of laboratory organisms to edit the genomes of entire wild populations. Dr. Esvelt earned his Bachelor of Arts in Chemistry and Biology at Harvey Mudd College and his PhD in biochemistry at Harvard University. He's testified before in Congress. Dr. Esvelt, welcome to the committee. You are now recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, members of the committee, it's an honor to testify today. I speak on my own behalf and not on behalf of MIT. I believe that the best interests of the United States and public trust in science require congressional action on issues of biosafety and biosecurity. And I believe that that action will require us to take into account past and future advances in technology. Today, thousands of skilled individuals can create infectious viruses using commercially available synthetic DNA that corresponds to publicly accessible viral genome sequences. To test our nation's ability to control access to pandemic viruses, my team at MIT, with FBI approval, ordered DNA encoding fragments of the 1918 influenza virus from 38 DNA synthesis firms. The genome sequence of this virus, which killed 50 million people, was published by federal researchers in 2005, when synthetic DNA was 1,000 times more expensive, and hardly any researchers could construct an infectious virus from synthetic DNA. Both of those have now changed. 1918 influenza may not cause a pandemic today, but if you consider a 10% chance of another COVID, that would equate to over 100,000 American lives and more than $1 trillion in economic damage. Of those 38 gene synthesis providers, 36 shipped DNA, enough to make the infectious virus 3 times over, even though the person placing the orders did so using a pseudonym, had no ties to influenza research, and falsely claimed to work for an organization that does not perform wet lab research at all. Everything that we did and the companies did was entirely legal. There are no laws regulating DNA synthesis, even though the industry group, the International Gene Synthesis Consortium, has requested congressional regulation. They don't want to sell harmful DNA to anyone who isn't authorized, but there is no one to tell them which researchers and experiments are legitimate. This is true even though 1918 influenza is a select agent. Anyone can still legally purchase DNA sufficient to make the virus as long as that DNA is in pieces, even though we have gifted high school students who can stitch those pieces together. To put it mildly, this is not how we regulate fissile materials and blueprints for nuclear devices. Unlike pathogens that have zero chance of causing a pandemic, 1918 is not even the highest tier of select agent, nor does working with it require biosafety level 4 conditions. This is true even after COVID has taught us that transmissibility is of extreme importance. Why have we not updated? Well, perhaps because there is no single agency or board in charge of biosafety and biosecurity, but perhaps also because the agencies in charge of this research currently regulate themselves. And this is a bad idea. I have tremendous respect for Dr. Parker's achievements as chair of the NSABB. But at the end of the day, in that role, he reports to a department whose research he ostensibly oversees. And they can dismiss him or ignore him as they please. And that is not adequate, trustworthy oversight. Now, I love science. Frankly, I would rather my lab not be subject to more paperwork and regulation. That can be harmful to progress. But public mistrust also harms science. And the way to build trust is to earn it, which doesn't happen when you insist on regulating yourself. We are overdue for a systemic reappraisal of which pathogens, DNA, and experiments are dangerous for safety and which for security, which are not the same thing. So I urge Congress to empower and fund an independent board to assess which labs should have access to which agents and sequences, to decide when the benefits of dual-use research exceed the risks, and to determine when sharing a genome sequence or an experimental outcome would cause irreparable harm to national security. The board's decision should be made with total transparency, except when national security requires otherwise. The board should include scientists, but also machine learning experts, security analysts, diplomats, and most importantly, members of the general public who need to have a voice. Had such an independent board existed in 2005, when researchers first decided to publish the genome sequence of 1918 influenza virus, I would be considerably more confident that doing so was the responsible course of action. And if such a board existed today, I would be much more confident that future decisions about finding, predicting, or engineering credible pandemic pathogens will benefit our nation and the world. Thank you.
Dr. Rowland, in May, the White House released a new research oversight policy that goes into effect next spring, as you're well aware. Would you let the committee know what you think this policy improves in terms of prior versions, and give us a little bit of detail on those improvements?
Thank you, Senator Peters. I strongly support the updated policy, the DIRC PEP policy that the White House put out. It streamlines the process for oversight of these dual-use experiments, combining what previously had been 3 separate policies for federal and institutional oversight of dual-use research of concern, as well as a policy for departmental review of enhanced pandemic pathogens. The new policy also expands the scope of agents that fall under the policy and need additional levels of oversight and review, and includes, for example, not just human health pathogens, but pathogens relevant to animal and plant health, which I strongly support because I think that's long been a neglected part of our policy process. The policy provides an opportunity to really have a iterative conversation at multiple levels with roles for the principal investigator, for the research institution, for the agency, and then independently at the department level and across government, opportunities to weigh the risks and benefits of that research in a way that allows you to consider those prior to making funding decisions.
So are there any gaps in the policy?
The policy still is limited to federal funding of research. It is one of the many tools in the toolbox by which we can use the power of publicly funded research to ensure that we are conducting research ethically, safely, and in a secure manner. However, it doesn't extend beyond federally funded research, although the policy does extend beyond an individual funding agency at the institutional level, in that it has expectations for the institution beyond just an individual project to really apply the scope of the policy to anything that falls within it. But again, that's only applicable to publicly funded institutions.
Dr. Esfeld, as was stated, this new policy applies only to federal funding. Should independent oversight agency also regulate research supported by non-federal funding as well? Do you see that as a significant gap?
Yes, Chairman, I agree that the gap provided by non-federal funding is a major one. The policy does attempt to take this into account by requesting that entities that receive federal and non-federal funding regulate the research that is performed using non-federal funding. However, this does still leave out a large fraction of entities. And I believe in order to be consistent with security policies in other domains, we should regulate non-federally funded research within our borders and take international action to discourage research in this vein, which I believe harms our national security.
You mentioned international action. Dr. Wollenetz, should the U.S. do something to deal with oversight of research that's being done outside of the United States as well?
Thank you, Chairman Peters. I worry a lot more about research involving pathogens that takes place outside of the United States than I do about the system within the United States. Our biosafety, biosecurity system within the U.S. may not be perfect. It still involves human beings, and so there is still the possibility of accidents. However, I feel a lot more comfortable with it than I do with the promulgation of high-consequence pathogen research around around the world, particularly in the wake of the pandemic. And so I think, in fact, it's imperative for the U.S. to use the levers at our disposal in order to try to raise the norms and standards and regulations around the world for this sort of research, whether that is through the carrots and sticks incentive of funding research in foreign nations where we impose our requirements for oversights and conduct on them, or supporting the adoption of enforceable and accountable mechanisms like the international standard I mentioned, ISO 35001.
Very good. Dr. Parker, I think I'm concerned, I know members of our committee are concerned that lab safety and security standards, let alone the standards in other countries, are not adequate to ensure that risky research can be properly contained in labs that are working on these dangerous pathogens. So Dr. Parker, I would like you to comment on the state of biosafety and biosecurity standards, and specifically what we should do to ensure that we're addressing what you consider the largest threats that we face.
Sure, thank you, Senator Peters. And I want to also just first echo the concern about the international space, and we're going to have to, I think, step up and do more from leadership on the international stage. But biosafety and biosecurity standards, they've evolved over the years through best practices. One thing that I think is a gap is we don't have a dedicated research program focused on biosafety. What are the evidence-based that we can actually better improve our biosafety, and then making sure that that supports any biosecurity mandates that may be coming down, so they're more evidence-based. We need to, and that's in my written testimony about how we need to better support that going forward. And we need better ways to more in real time share best practices. We do have, and that means more real-time sharing of, say, laboratory incidents, near misses, so that we can capture those lessons in real time, share them with other labs and so forth. I cannot overemphasize the importance of our high containment research enterprise. That really is the foundation of our preparedness planning for the emergence of the next dangerous thing that's going to come out of nature. So we have to support that, but we have to have a strong foundation of laboratory biosafety and biosecurity to do that.
Thank you, Doctor. Ranking Member Paul, you're recognized for your questions.
So the debate that Congress and the Senate will have to have is whether or not White House policy is enough. I think they're well-intentioned. I think they want to fix a problem that exists. But we've had this conversation before. In about 2010, 2011, when the avian flu was mutated to become aerosolized and more easily spread among mammals, there was a pause between 2014 and 2016. But throughout the pause, there were exemptions given to many research, and then there's some research that mysteriously just doesn't show up in any documents. So, for example, the research in Wuhan that many of us believe evidence points towards the lab leak causing the pandemic was never reviewed. We then set up a committee called the P3CO committee, which was supposed to be in charge of looking at the safety of dangerous research. They looked at exactly 3 research projects. They complained and said, well, we didn't have the ability to go out and grab research. We could only take what was given to us. So there are limitations of the internal changes. In fact, one of the grave mistakes that was made is that the research in Wuhan was never even looked at by the P3CO committee. It was never paused. And Anthony Fauci will say, my people up and down told me it was not gain of function. And yet there's not one scrap of paper of any discussion ever occurring over whether it was gain of function or not. There have been camps for a long time. People say, is this Republicans versus Democrats? No, but it's contentious, and there have been scientists on both sides of this from the very beginning. Really, probably all the way back to the Spanish flu in 2005, but certainly since 2010. And people need to realize that there are people on polar extremes, and Anthony Fauci was a polar extreme. He believed, and he said in 2012, that even if a pandemic should occur, the knowledge was worth it. So I guess my question to begin for Dr. Redfield was, do you think that taking a coronavirus, the backbone of a SARS coronavirus, and swapping out S proteins from unknown viruses, do you think that's research that should be scrutinized for potentially being gain of function or dangerous? Does it bother you that the internal regulations that were put in place didn't seem to work to catch that Wuhan research?
Yes, I think the problem is the program can't be passive. And I think while I respect some of the improvements that happened with the May decisions that the White House has, I still think this is sort of a passive volunteer program for compliance. And so clearly, I think there has to be a much more active engagement. And one of the things that I want to come back to that I said earlier, and people will disagree with me, but I think they should reflect on what I'm about to say. In 2024, 2025, biosecurity is our nation's greatest national security threat. You need to think of it the same way we thought about the verge of nuclear, atomic, in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. And, you know, Congress and our country was very aggressive in putting some standards around how we did nuclear research and where we did it. I think we have to have that same vigor towards this biological gain-of-function research right now. It has the potential to be much more catastrophic than, let's say, an isolated nuclear event.
So in preparing this bill to set up an independent board, we interviewed dozens of scientists. We asked them their opinions on this, what has to be done differently. And probably the number one thing people came back to us is that they believe the people making the judgment on the danger of the research should not be people dispensing money or receiving money, because it's just a conflict of interest. And accusations have been made. We don't know what people's motivations are, but when there are multi-million-dollar awards being given after certain opinions change or evolve over time, then the question is whether or not the money motivates the change. And really, so what we did in setting the independent commission up that we hope to pass into legislation is to have people who have, are no longer receiving, they could have been working for NIH, but they're no longer receiving benefits. They're not in the dispensing part, to try to get more objective look at this. We also put people on the committee that would have a national security look at this as well. And they can have both. People like Dr. Redfield have had both experiences of looking at national security and the science of this. And also, we don't ban anything. We don't ban gain-of-function research. It's really important what the definition is, and it requires some guidances and then scientists. But to Dr. Esvelt, do you think it's important that this be outside of the traditional NIH grant funding process and to get rid of conflict of interest, or do you think it can be done with in-house at NIH?
Thank you, Senator. I strongly believe that to provide trustworthy oversight, it has to be located outside the chains of funding in either direction, exactly as you outlined.
Right. Dr. Esvelt, the history of this, if you could sort of review again, just because some people think this started with COVID, you know, going back to Spanish flu and avian flu, that there's been really a long-running debate in the scientific community about the benefits. Some people say, well, as Anthony Fauci, the knowledge is always worth it, the risk doesn't matter, the knowledge is worth it. But then other people say we've never developed any vaccines from gain-of-function research and that it hasn't been nearly as productive as some would argue. Can you comment a little bit on the history of this debate, where the debate's going, and what your opinion is on Dr. Redfield? I'm sorry, I was directing that one back to Dr. Redfield.
I think it's an important debate to have, and I think you've highlighted. If I was sitting here 20 years ago, I would probably have the view that we may want to consider gain-of-function research as a way for us to get a jump start on countermeasures, because the pace of science was so slow. I know when I became CDC director, I was very concerned about a bird flu pandemic. And historically, if that occurred, it would likely take several years before we would have a vaccine or countermeasure. And so really for the first couple of years, it would just be a body count. But I will say the pace of science today is such that, and we saw it obviously with the COVID pandemic and the rapid development of the COVID vaccines, is such that we can really develop countermeasures really in weeks and months now. So I'm not of the view that we get such a jump start with gain-of-function research. And I do think there has to be a very aggressive debate of whether there's any benefit from that research. I think you are right. I'm not aware of any advanced therapeutic or vaccine that has come to pass because of gain-of-function research. So I'm still reticent. I do want to have a vigorous public debate about its benefit, and if it's determined that it has benefit, and I want society to be involved in that debate, not just scientists, then how do we do it in a safe, responsible, and effective way that protects our national security, which I do believe it has to be highly regulated.
Thank you. Senator Johnson, recognized for your
Thank you,
questions.
Mr. Chairman. Appreciate you holding this hearing. What I know of your bill, Senator Paul, I'm sure I'm going to co-sponsor it once I review it. But I want to take this in a slightly different direction because I've never had Dr. Redfield before me. The cover-up of the funding of dangerous research is not the only area that our federal agencies have been covering up, been lying to us, not been transparent. I've sent over 60 oversight letters to the agencies, been largely ignored. I'll flash this one more time. These are the last 50 pages of the Fauci emails that I've been trying to get unredacted for the last couple of years. One of my oversight letters, that's what I really want to focus on, is the standard operating procedures, Dr. Redfield, that your agency issued 9 days after you left. So I'm assuming you had some input in that or knowledge of it. So they issued a standard operating procedure in terms of the analysis of the VAERS system. Are you aware of that? That they were going to be doing proportional reporting ratios and empirical Bayesian analysis on VAERS?
Senator, I'm really not up to speed on that.
Okay, so is there any reason why the CDC, if they're doing those analyses, proportional reporting ratios and empirical Bayesian analysis, why they wouldn't release that to a member of Congress, a senator, requesting to see that data, and quite honestly, release it to the public? Is there any reason for them to withhold that information?
I totally agree with what you are pointing out. You know, I'm disturbed that there's not much more aggressive release to the public of the data they have about safety of these vaccines. I think it's not appropriate.
So they are withholding it.
Yeah.
I think I understand why. You know, let me put up my chart. It is true, by the way, they were touting VAERS. Mr. Tom Shimabukuro, in October of 2020, about a month and a half beforehand, was talking about what a great system this is going to be. Do you agree with that? I mean, I could give you the quote. So I don't want to take, trust me, you were touting the VAERS system. But once the numbers started coming in, I think by April, we had over 2,000 deaths reported worldwide in the VAERS system. About 40-some% of those were occurring on days 0, 1, or 2. So that was concerning. I realize the limitations of VAERS, but here's the current VAERS report compared to other drugs, by the way. The top of the one is ivermectin. This is the one the FDA says horse paste. Come on, y'all, you're not a cow, you're not a horse. On average, over 27 years, 16 deaths per year. Let's move this chair. Hydroxychloroquine, 80 deaths per year over 36 years. The flu vaccine, in 54 years of reporting, no, 33 years of reporting, a total of 2,500 deaths, about 75 a year. Let me skip ahead, because we have Tylenol, we have other things as well. The COVID vaccines, over 37,000 deaths. Today, by the way, 24% of those deaths reported are occurring on the day of vaccination or within 2 days. That's about 11,000 a year. So, Dr. Redfield, I appreciate the fact that you've actually admitted that vaccine injuries are real. They're a lot more significant. I mean, total number of adverse events reported, 1.6 million. And of course, one of the problems with VAERS is it dramatically understates the number of vaccine injuries. So, a couple questions I have for you, because you would agree that we were generally led to believe that the vaccine would stay in our arm, correct?
Yeah, I think, again, the people oversold the vaccine and didn't give transparent comments about the potential side effects.
So again, we were told it was going to stay in our arm, right?
Yeah,
Okay. We were told this was mRNA, going to degrade rapidly in our body, right? But it wasn't mRNA, was it? It was modified RNA. Mm-hmm. It was actually produced synthetically so it wouldn't degrade. And we now have studies that say the mRNA is circulating in the body at least, I think, 2 months, and we haven't done studies beyond that, correct? I know in your own practice, you don't administer that because you realize the spike protein is toxic to the body.
I prefer the killed protein vaccines.
When did you first determine, or when did you first find out about the biodistribution studies Pfizer had done that the Japanese regulators released in February of 2021?
Probably
on the lipid nanoparticles.
Yeah, probably somewhere in the spring or summer of 21. It was clear that the mRNA in some patients was persisting much longer than it should.
When did you find out about the biodistribution of the lipid nanoparticles, or when did people in the FDA, when should have they known about the fact that they were biodistributing all over the body?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I was telling you the summer of 2021 is when I probably became more aware that this...
only because the Japanese regulators released that. But again, this is part of the Pfizer studies. So they knew that the lipid nanoparticle, which is designed to permeate difficult to permeate barriers, correct?
Okay.
That's the design of the lipid nanoparticle. So they knew it was going to biodistribute all over the body, concentrating in the ovaries, the adrenal glands. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, correct?
Correct.
So what would let's just, again, you're a doctor. What happens when you have a lipid nanoparticle biodistributing, and let's say this mRNA, this modified mRNA, attaches to a heart muscle? What is it? It injects itself into the cells, causes that heart muscle cell to produce a spike protein, correct? Which is toxic to the body. And then what does the body do?
It has a very strong pro-inflammatory response, which is problematic. Again, I think, Senator, what you're getting at, which I'm 100% agreeing with you, is I think there was not appropriate transparency from the beginning about the potential side effects of these vaccines. And I do think there was inappropriate decisions by some to try to report any side effects because they argued that would make the public less likely to get vaccinated. I do think one of the greatest mistakes that was made, of course, was mandating these vaccines. They should have never been mandated. It should have been open to personal choice. They don't prevent infection. They do have side effects. I'm going to clinic this afternoon.
But again, I appreciate your admitting side effects, but you have to admit the people of the agencies, the Marks, the Dr. Marks, the Dr. Woodcock, they're still, by and large, denying this, right? They're saying, well, they're mild, they're rare, and they're mild.
The FDA
they're not rare, and they're severe to death.
The FDA should release all of the safety data they have. I was very disappointed to hear that they were planning to hold on to that till 2026. That really creates a sense of total lack of trust in our public health agencies towards vaccination. It's counterproductive.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm not getting cooperation out of the chairman of the Permanent Subcommittee investigation to issue subpoenas to get this information. You have not yet issued a subpoena to get the final 50 pages unredacted. I would suggest we do that. Again, as important as the cover-up of the origin story is, there's a lot more that's being covered up. The public has a right to know. We pay for these agencies, we pay their salaries, we fund these studies, and they're not giving them to us. So again, I would ask you, again, appreciate this hearing, this is important. There are many aspects of our miserably failed response to COVID that needs to be uncovered, not the least of which the sabotage of early treatment, which I didn't have time to get into. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Marshall, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome again to our witnesses. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I greatly appreciate the direction of this series of hearings is going. Senator Paul's Risky Research Review Act is a giant leap for mankind. It might be the start of something that will save tens of millions of lives, and I commend him, and we'll do everything we can to put wind beneath your sail to get this across the finish line. My concern is there's not enough national security emphasis on this. It's stunning to me as I go back and talk to the folks that knew the most at the beginning of COVID were the national security people. They were not surprised at all. So, Dr. Redfield, I want to talk about the next pandemic and whether it's man-made or from nature, I don't care. We all realize the flu vaccine works 25 or 50% of the time. The mRNA vaccines were going to be the cure-all that they're not. What do you think would be if you were going to line up a scenario for us to practice, what would be the virus? And talk a little bit about vaccines as opposed to therapeutics.
Well, I think it's very probable that we will have another pandemic. I think it's very probable that the pandemic pathogen will be bird flu. The current bird flu, as you know, is now in over 100 million chicken and turkeys in the United States alone. It's global. It's an H5N1 virus. That virus now has gone into 27 mammal species in the United States, including cats and mice and bears and surprisingly dolphins and seals. So it's quite extensive. It doesn't seem to have learned how to go mammal to mammal when it gets into those mammals. It seems to go bird to mammal.
Okay.
And you know it's been in 5 humans in the United States since 2019. And it has been in about 888 humans across the world since 2003, and it raises concern because of those 888 individuals, there have been about 52% mortality, so there's a high mortality rate. So I think it's very likely that this virus will continue to go out and try to learn how to infect different mammals, including humans, and eventually it will evolve so it can transmit efficiently human to human. We know exactly what has to happen for that to happen. There's 4 amino acids that need to change. It was published in 2012. I was not an advocate that it would be published because I thought it would show terrorists a recipe to how to create a catastrophic virus.
Yeah.
But it was published. You know, Senator Marshall, I'm a man of faith. I think it's kind of a miracle that no one's exploited that yet to cause global chaos. But I am more concerned that the virus could be created in university labs. Labs are doing experiments that are trying to understand how to manipulate this virus and then be subject to accidental laboratory leak. And once respiratory viruses get leaked, they're very hard to contain. So I'm very concerned about that. On the other side of your question, I think that the United States is not prepared proportional to the threat. As I said, I think this is the greatest national security threat our nation faces. We have a $900 billion Defense Department for the threat of China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia. We don't have really any systematic agency or network of private sector contractors to help us with the biosecurity threat, which I believe we should have. We need a proportional response to the threat. I'd like to see us build within the Department of Energy, since they're used to weapons of mass destruction, they have a good science base, for them to basically get the mission to help build our biosecurity response and then build a series of private sector enterprises, like you mentioned, antiviral drug development and vaccine, diagnostics, PPE, as well as medical equipment that you can predict we'll need. When COVID happened, you remember Vice President Pence went up to Michigan to the Ford manufacturers to ask them to stop making Fords and start to making ventilators.
Yeah, Dr. Redfield, if I could interrupt you. So I want you to really nail this, the vaccine versus therapeutics. Therapeutics stop transmission. So if suddenly we found, heaven forbid, the bird flu was in humans, we could go in there with a therapeutic and stop the really stop the spread. Am I right or wrong?
Yeah, I think your point, Senator, is exactly right. Too much weight is on vaccines. They're part of the response, but it's not where the money is. The money is in antiviral drug development. That's where the money is. The way I keep my patients alive today that get COVID that are over the age of 65 is the antiviral drugs. And what we really need to have for bird flu, because we don't have them right now, is multiple antivirals that are highly efficacious against bird flu, and we don't have it. We should have it.
Talk about the supply chain, what we don't have in this country for you to be able to develop those antivirals. There's some chemicals and rare earth stuff that you need that I don't have.
Yeah, there's different technologies, and this is where I think this should invest in platform technologies that can protect us. Right now, for many drugs, you need to get an active pharmaceutical agreement and ingredient, and the sources of that is really 2, India and China, right? There's an alternative platform, which I'm a big advocate of, which is to use the mRNA platform, not for vaccines now, but for therapeutics.
Okay.
And if I do use the mRNA for therapeutics, what I need to do is just procure 4 nucleotides, which I can procure right now.
And then
I can put them in
we're eliminating the risk of developing the vaccine to be leaked. I mean,
Yeah,
developing a vaccine often leads to leaks, it seems
Yeah,
like.
I just think that we should have a robust therapeutic program that builds technology that's independent of needing to go get active pharmaceutical ingredients from China and India. And that technology exists today using the mRNA technology, not for vaccine development, but using it for therapeutic product development.
Dr. Esfeld, let's talk about national security just one more time here. In my humble mind, a viral biosecurity issue is a bigger issue than China's military threat to us. This is way more important than how many more submarines we build. Those submarines are important. Why wouldn't we apply the same type of rules and regulations to anybody that's working with nuclear energy, nuclear physics, nuclear bombs? I mean, this is 10 times worse as well.
Yeah, Senator, I think you're exactly.
I'm sorry, let's get
Oh,
Dr.
I'm sorry,
Esfeld's
go ahead.
opinion here.
Thank you, Senator. The answer is that even though there are many benefits to nuclear energy, there's a lot more benefits to biotechnology in many different disciplines. And so carving out the fraction that is dangerous and poses these risks to national security, which is overwhelmingly due to agents that can transmit efficiently. That is the tiniest fraction of all biomedical research. And I believe we dramatically underregulate that and frankly overregulate much of the rest of it.
Thank you. Senator Hawley, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of the witnesses for being here. Dr. Wollenitz, if I could start with you. You served as the Chief of Staff to Francis Collins for 4 years, is that right?
That's correct, Senator.
From 2017 to 2021, is that
Yes,
correct?
that's
so
correct.
right through the heart of the pandemic.
Yes.
I noticed that Dr. Collins was intensely interested in discrediting the lab leak. I guess we'll call it a hypothesis. I think it's probably a little bit stronger than that now that we know something of what our intelligence agencies have long assessed. Last month, I had the chance to speak with Dr. Robert Gary, who sat right where you are, who co-authored that really, frankly, shameless propaganda piece, the Proximal Origin paper, which infamously stated that the SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct or a purposely manipulated virus. It went on to say it could not possibly have come from a lab. This, of course, we now know is not what multiple U.S. intelligence agencies assessed. What interests me is that your office was very involved in that paper, which was supposed to be an independent piece of scientific analysis. But Dr. Collins actually called Dr. Gary when he was supposedly working on the paper on February 1st, 2020. Is it normal for scientists who are supposedly doing independent research to get together and talk about how their conclusions are going to come out?
Thank you for the question, Senator Hawley. I think in general, yes, it is quite common for scientists across biomedical research fields, while they're in the process of doing research, to discuss with colleagues and other scientists. I do not believe that that is an accurate description of the conversations that took place.
Well, tell us, what were the nature of the conversations?
So while I was not present for those conversations, my understanding based on readouts is there was a lot of interest in the origins and current understanding of SARS-CoV-2. And I think it's important when we're talking about the term lab leak theory to differentiate between the idea of a virus escaping from a lab, which is a biosafety violation, versus a virus that is engineered or manipulated in the lab and then escapes.
Yeah, and your boss and Dr. Fauci tried to discredit both of those things. They said that the lab was absolutely not involved. We know that at the time that this paper was supposedly being written, because we now have the private correspondence from Dr. Fauci, your boss said that it was a very destructive conspiracy to think that there was a lab involved. So he's on the phone with a scientist, quote-unquote scientist, who's supposedly writing an independent paper. By the way, Dr. Gary testified under oath that he was coming to his conclusions while this paper was being written. He was discovering the answers. But we now know that your boss was on the phone with him saying this is a very destructive conspiracy before the paper was even written. My question is, why was your office so intent on pushing to the public the idea that this could not possibly have been a lab issue. Is it because of the NIH's role in funding gain-of-function research at the lab? Is that the reason why?
So, Senator Hawley, I would say that in the event of any new and emerging infectious disease, if you've ever gone through a tabletop exercise in biosecurity,
Yeah. Answer my question. Is it because that NIH was actually helping to fund, EcoHealth was funding gain-of-function research?
No, I believe that's an inaccurate assessment.
In fact, your boss misled Congress and testified falsely that NIH and the EcoHealth had never conducted gain-of-function research in Wuhan, correct?
No, that's incorrect.
He did testify that.
I believe, sir, that what he testified to was that there was no evidence at that time that NIH was funding research that met the scope of the P3CO policy, which I want to differentiate from the term gain-of-function research,
of course, this is the classic. Term. This is the classic. Now that we've lied, now that you have, and your office lied to the American people for years, told the American people that a lab leak was a very destructive conspiracy. That's your boss's statement while you were his chief of staff. Of course, we now know that that was the conspiracy to hide this from the American people, to censor people who went out and said, you know what, actually, maybe this is a lab leak. Your office, Dr. Fauci and others, tried to actively censor them. There was a propaganda effort that this paper was the center of, and now everybody says, oh well, we just weren't sure at the time. We didn't really know. You knew exactly what you were doing. You were actively misleading the American people the entire time. Get this, after that paper, it's really an opinion piece, was published, your boss then says to Dr. Fauci that he had really hoped that the paper would settle this. Is there anything more that we can do to shut down this destructive conspiracy? This is in April of 2020. And then Dr. Fauci went to the White House podium and said that absolutely there's no way that this could have come from a lab. Let me come back to my original question. Why was your office so intent on shutting down any talk about this being involved with a lab? Why? I don't understand it. Why the hysteria?
So, Senator Hawley, I will say that my understanding of the situation is that no one at NIH, including Dr. Collins, Dr. Fauci, myself, ever suggested that there wasn't the possibility that a virus had escaped from a lab.
Oh, that's ridiculous. Let me just stop you right there. I cannot have these lies just continue to be told over and over again. Sorry, and wrong. That's false. You people repeatedly said it could not have come from a lab. Your boss said it was a very destructive conspiracy. Not that it was unlikely, not that it was not the best idea, a conspiracy. And based on that, you censored, and your administration that you worked for actively censored scientists, journalists, and what we now know is our own intelligence agencies at the same time were concluding and briefing members of Congress that it likely was from a lab leak. I mean, it's extraordinary. And now you've been caught red-handed because you thought that the rest of us wouldn't find out. You thought that the public would always be kept in the dark. And as it turns out, we now know these emails have become public that you were pushing this propaganda effort and yet claiming the mantle of science. Don't you see that what you have done has set back the respectability and integrity of science by generations? You were acting as propagandists. Do you regret your role in any of this?
So, Senator Hawley, I don't think you've characterized
Do you
my
regret your role in
of
any of the
NIH.
misleading of the public? Do you regret your role in your office saying that a lab nexus here is a very destructive conspiracy? Do you regret your role in helping censor millions of Americans who were kicked off social media, who were disciplined at work for saying that maybe a lab was involved, which we now know the FBI thinks is the case? Do you regret it?
I do not believe I ever had the role that you're describing.
Do you regret anything that you did during this period? Do you regret not speaking out? Do you regret not advising your boss to temper his comments? Do you regret not opposing the censorship? Do you regret it? You're in a position of tremendous influence.
I do not believe censorship took place, sir.
You don't believe censorship took place?
I do not.
What world are you living in? Tell that to the scientists who basically lost their credentials. Tell that to the people who were kicked off of social media and banned because they asked about a lab leak. You don't believe censorship took place? The privilege is astounding. You were the chief of staff at the NIH pushing these conspiracies, pushing the effort to shut down Americans, and now you have the gall to sit here and say censorship never took place. I mean, it's unbelievable. Unbelievable. I can't believe, I cannot believe that that's your testimony. And frankly, I can't believe you have the gall to sit here and say that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Rosen, you're recognized for your questions.
Senator Peters, may I have a chance to expand on my comments for a moment?
If you could be brief, please. We have other questions.
Yes, thank you. I think I want to make it very clear that I certainly, and I do believe this is true of others at NIH as well, including Dr. Collins and Dr. Fauci, have never dismissed that the potential origins of SARS-CoV-2 leading to the COVID-19 pandemic are known, that there is that we just don't have the evidence to be able to make a determination.
That's not what the paper said. The paper said it couldn't have come from a lab. It could not have come from a lab. Your boss said it was a very destructive conspiracy. But
please let her finish.
I'd like to go forward with my questions, please.
But let's just finish your last thoughts, and then we'll move on.
My reading of the proximal origin paper is that it did not say that it could not have come from a lab. It said that it was highly implausible that it was engineered and that no determination could be made as to the absolute origin.
And censorship never happened. Unbelievable.
Senator Rosen, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Chair Peters. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Appreciate that. I'm going to talk a little bit about university research. Because Nevada universities, well, they're doing cutting-edge biological research, including work focused on viruses. Our university scientists are leading the way on everything from studying how monoclonal antibodies could be used to detect and treat Ebola, or how to boost the body's own immune system to kill virally infected cells, and many other areas of critical medical research. So, Dr. Parker, as a university researcher, you understand both the importance of the work that's being conducted in research labs and the challenges universities face from a security perspective when dealing with serious viruses. So what recommendations do you have for us here in Congress on additional technical assistance or grant funding that might be used for university labs to do this life-saving work on breakthrough research and making sure we're doing it in the safest way possible?
Sure. Thank you for the question and the comments about the importance of our university research enterprise across the United States. It absolutely is. It is essential, and the vast majority of the research that is conducted in our universities and the research that you talked about that may involve working with hazardous pathogens does not cross into this lane of what I call the DIRC-PEP. The new dual-use research concern and the pathogens with enhanced pandemic potential. So the vast majority doesn't even get into that lane. But nonetheless, the new policy, though, it gives a lot of responsibility to our principal investigators and research institutions. And they have the primary responsibility now to flag, identify whether their research may cross into that lane. And so I'm going to go now to implementation of this new DIRC-PEP policy. They're going to have a lot of help. This does actually put a lot of additional responsibilities, and those responsibilities will come with accountability. And they will need to have a lot of help from the federal funding agencies and departments, and they're going to have resources. And so and they're going to have congressional help to ensure that those things happen. But again, I want to emphasize that the vast majority of our university enterprise does not cross into that, but we want to make sure they don't.
Well, I want to build on that a little bit because, of course, with the advent of artificial intelligence and virtual modeling, we're maybe able to avoid some of these safety issues or get around them or make things safer because we use the artificial intelligence. We're able to use the virtual modeling. We're able to do multiple iterations and generations of research just by computing power. And so predictive analytics are going to continue to advance. Technology is going to play a larger role in this research. And I think it's going to bring new opportunities, and hopefully it will minimize, not all the risks, you still have to do other things, but possibly minimize those risks. So Dr. Wolanetz, throughout your career, how has the integration of technology been integrated into the lab? How has it changed the work that you've done? And what new vulnerabilities does it open up for you? Maybe instead of having the actual virus, but now you may have cyber attacks.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. I think you're asking exactly the right questions that we need to be thinking about. As science evolves, as technology evolves, it's always important to think about how that moving landscape alters our assessment of benefit and risk in real time as best as we can, noting that it's evolving technology and we don't always know where it's going to go. So that, I think, speaks as to the need for both flexible policy frameworks to be able to make those risk and benefit assessments among that moving landscape, but also the importance of the fundamental knowledge about viruses that allow us to move into this space of using maybe alternative methods like computation in a way that might be safer than handling actual viruses. Right now, our computational tools, they're getting better, but they're not great at predicting phenotype of the virus from genotype. And so the more we study viruses, the better those tools will get. And then we do need to think about the cybersecurity and information risks.
Well, of course, as you get more information, artificial intelligence, just like anyone, it gets better by the input. So the more you give it, the better it's going to learn. But I do think that you talk about balancing risk. I'm going to follow up with you as well. I'm going to go on to Dr. Parker and again, Dr. Wolanetz, is that scientific research always carries risk. We know that. Risk and reward. We hope we cure things, right? And so some of that risk is the actual research. It's the proper safety protocol, containment, and control of information, as we discussed with cybersecurity. But not pursuing critical research, it also carries a risk that can be fatal because that means we're not going to be prepared for eventuality or potentiality of something happening. And so we want to be able to have treatments or understanding as we move forward against either existing viruses or future variants. So what do you see the best way? I'll start with Dr. Parker, and then we'll go to Dr. Wolanetz. The best way to balance being prepared for the next serious viral outbreak, such as a drug-resistant strain of tuberculosis maybe becoming airborne, or just whatever those needs are to prevent any risk from happening?
Sure. Well, first, we have to understand what's happening, and that means we have to have public health surveillance, animal health surveillance, so we understand what is in our environment, what may be coming our way. That doesn't mean we go to the laboratory and create a novel virus, though. So we have to understand.
The data sharing between countries, between labs, about what you're finding on the field, right?
We have to have international collaboration, and there are smart ways to do international collaboration, and we need to pursue those things. So first is what's in our environment. And then second, we also have to have the strong research and development platform, thinking about the vaccine candidates that we need to be preparing for and how those would move into advanced development and manufacturing. And we don't have the capability to do that strong advanced development and manufacturing if bird flu, in fact, were to start infecting humans tomorrow.
Think about the supply chain.
And all the supply chains, everything is associated with that. But all that does not need us to develop especially dangerous pandemic-capable viruses in the laboratory to do what I just said.
Right. Thank you. Would you like to finish for a second here?
Yes, I'll just quickly add that there is a lot more that we don't know about the world around us than that we do know. And so it is important to consider asking those questions. We wouldn't do the science if we knew the answers. So there is always going to be some measure of unpredictability in terms of being able to gauge both the benefit and the risk of any given research project, and particularly when you're talking about projects involving pathogens. However, we are, as we know, that fundamental knowledge feeds back into our risk-benefit equation in a way that makes it better as we go. And I strongly support Dr. Parker's earlier recommendation that if we invest in applied biosafety and biosecurity research to really fundamentally understand what methodologies and procedures can actually improve our safety and security, the better off we will be in managing those risks.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
I've heard each of our witnesses use terms gain of function, high-risk research, but as I listen to you, I'm not sure we have a shared understanding of what kind of research we should actually focus on. So I want to drill down a little bit into that. Dr. Wolynets, can high-risk life science research or gain-of-function research be clearly defined? And if so, how you define it?
Thank you for the question, Senator Peters. I think good definitions are so critical to good policy, especially when we're talking about statutory definitions, because if you don't start from that place, there's a danger of either under-regulating and then we're not solving the problem that we're trying to solve, or over-regulating and potentially stifling innovation. Risk is an especially problematic term because it immediately raises the question, risk of what, and also risk relative to what. High risk is a equally problematic term because, in fact, it's quite common use in science. We talk about high risk, high reward research in a very positive way. We talk about high risk human subjects research, like first in humans trials. So, a lot of the debate has really centered around research that poses immediate and predictable threat to human health. And understandably, a lot of that has been around pathogens. Is that the only area that poses potential public health risk? No, and I think that is a conversation worth having, but it is really important to define these areas very specifically.
And Dr. Redfield, if an independent agency were created to review and approve high-risk research, what specific risk, if you be very specific, risk should this agency focus on?
I think from my perspective, the risk is an assessment of the national security implications of the research. I think that's what I'm really looking at. What are the national security implications of this research? Not necessarily what the biological benefit is to clinical medicine to improve the human condition, which is normally what we all look at when we do biomedical research. But I think we need to bring in people that are looking at this, are there national security implications to this research? That's really what I'm trying to focus on.
Very good. And Dr. Parker, if an independent agency aims to reduce the most significant risk to public health, what kind of research should it oversee?
Sure, and first I want to agree with my colleagues on their answers to your questions. And it really kind of comes down, and I really want to emphasize the national security components. And in my testimony, I've kind of coined a new term called the security-related biosafety and things that may fall into that. But I think it's kind of been defined in this new DIRT-PEP policy. And that DIRT-PEP policy really follows the 2023 NSCB recommendations and how that may be defined. But even though those definitions and scope have been, I think, better defined, it's still going to come down to expert judgment. And then that expert judgment has got to be non-biased. It's got to have probing, frank discussions about those potential benefits. And if there are real compelling evidence to do such work, are the risks mitigated? And is it supported by sound ethical decisions? Thank you.
Thank you. Certainly, we've heard a lot of debate about the risk of virus research. Some scientists argue that the research is essential. Others are arguing nothing good can come of it. So we want to try to get to the bottom of that debate. And Dr. Wolynets, are there benefits to this type of high-risk research? And if there are benefits, do you have some examples that the committee could hear?
Thank you for the question. I'm so glad you asked it because I think it's really important to remind everybody that what we're talking about here is research oversight. And in some ways, the fact that these have benefits is a given. We're inherently talking about dual use research here, things that have potential benefit and also potential risks. And oversight is really a matter of assessing the relative benefit versus the relative risk. This is important because if there is literally no benefit, if we're not able to articulate even a potential benefit, and we're only talking about research that could be used for harm, that's a different category of research. That's biological weapons. And I don't think anyone is suggesting that there is any interest or attempt to create an offensive biological weapons. And so the right question is really, are there benefits relative to the risk involved in this sort of research? And to your earlier question about what kind of research are we talking about, how are we defining this? In general, we are talking about experiments in which you're taking a pathogen that we already fear might have potential pandemic opportunities and modifying it in a way that increases the transmissibility, increases the virulence. One of the most common examples that is used in which there is the potential for benefit to outweigh the risk is sometimes these pathogens, if we want to study them in the lab, we need to create animal models to be able to study them. And that often requires modifying the virus in such a way that allows the animal model to be a good model of human disease. When you start manipulating viruses, as we've noted, we don't always have the ability to predict what those manipulations will produce. And so, but we need those animal models to be able to fundamentally understand the virus and also develop the countermeasures against the virus. So that is a sort of generic example where you might see an assessment of the benefits outweighing the risk.
Dr. Parker, since the pandemic, the public has certainly raised a lot of questions about this research, and I would argue that without sufficient transparency, it's very hard for the public and Congress to trust that enough due diligence is actually being done by the agencies before these research projects are being funded. So my question for you, sir, is how could agencies or researchers be more engaged with the public and other stakeholders to demystify how these funding decisions are actually being made?
Senator Peters, thanks for the question. And transparency is just absolutely essential. And we have, unfortunately, entered into an era where public trust is, many feel like, has been betrayed in some of these research endeavors. So we're going to have to work double time to try to increase transparency into the review process. Sometimes we're not able to get to the specifics because of IP and et cetera, but we have to first and foremost give transparency, and the process is going to be effective. It's going to be something it's going to properly weigh those benefits and risks, and there'll be a good decision that comes out of that if any of this research does need to proceed. So we're really going to have to open it up. And then I look to my own experience as a previous laboratory commander at USAMRIID. Our high containment laboratories and those laboratory directors at the community level. I know I did a lot of work 25 years ago in trying to work with my community and just talk about the benefits of our research, how we were trying to do that safely and securely to protect our own workforce, but also protect the community. And I know there were skeptics, and I probably could have done a better job back 25 years ago in that transparency, but I knew my kids lived in the community, their friends and our friends. And so we had to make sure and talk about that. We're going to do it safely and security. So it starts at the federal level, but it actually is more important at the local level, where some of these high containment labs are, and working to build trust in their communities, which hopefully will spread out, beyond just those local communities. But it's absolutely essential that we work on transparency to rebuild public trust. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Paul, I know you have a request. I'd like to take that before making another statement.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record statements of support for my bill, Risky Research Review Act, from the scientific community and various stakeholder groups. Thank you.
Without objection, so ordered. I will now turn over the gavel to Ranking Member Paul, who will share the end of the meeting and bring us to a close. So with that, Ranking Member Paul, you now have the gavel.
Thank you. Dr. Wolanetz, during your tenure of working for Francis Collins, he sent an email to Anthony Fauci, and in the email he said that he directed Anthony Fauci to orchestrate a takedown of Drs. Kuldorf and Bhattacharya. Were you aware of that email at the time?
I don't specifically recall it.
Okay. I want to remind the panel that you all continue to be under oath, and it is a crime to lie to Congress. Were you directed by Francis Collins to participate in a takedown, malignment, disparagement of either Drs. Kuldorf or Bhattacharya?
No.
Did you plant any articles or discuss with anyone in the media articles that disparaged Dr. Kuldorf or Bhattacharya or their positions?
No.
In Dr. Fauci's response to this email, he responds by saying, don't worry, this is a paraphrase, don't worry, Dr. Collins, I'm on it. I got a story planted in Wired and I think another lay publication, but he was actively doing Dr. Collins' bidding. So I am surprised that as the Chief of Staff, you had no awareness of that there was a policy of taking down these scientists. Dr. Parker, you've had long, distinguished careers. Have you ever directed any of your employees to take down fellow scientists who you disagreed with?
No.
Dr. Redfield, you've had a long and distinguished career. Have you ever directed any of your employees to take down scientists who you had a disagreement with?
No.
Dr. Esvelt, same question.
No.
Dr. Wolonetz, did you attend the gain-of-function dual-use research of concern meetings during your tenure in government?
Yes.
Were you considered to be a member?
A member of what specifically,
I don't know.
Senator?
Is there a group called that? Is it a meeting? Who gets to go? Were you?
So I participated in many groups inside government in which biosecurity, management of dual-use research.
This is a very specific meeting, though. This is the week, it's called in this email, Weekly Dual-Use Research of Concern Gain-of-Function Meeting. Did you attend those routinely?
I don't recall a meeting called that, although it's quite possible I was involved. That name doesn't ring a bell.
This would be a meeting to discuss things that might be gain-of-function. Did you attend those meetings?
No, not if they were meetings at the level of an individual NIH institute to review research. I was not at all involved in that process.
This is a email. It's from Teresa, I don't know how you pronounce it, Hogwell? How do you know how to say it? H-A-U-G-U-E-L, and it's to, let's see, Irene Glowinski, Dennis Dixon, Linda Lambert, David Spiro. You familiar with those names?
I believe those are all employees of NIAID.
Okay. So you think this meeting may have occurred within NIAID and you might not have participated in it?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Are you surprised that when I asked for the debate over what is and what is not, because there's a debate over what is the definition of gain of function, that the NIH still refuses to give me minutes of these meetings or any of the discussion concerning what is gain of function and what is not gain of function?
I can't speak to NIH's decision.
Do you think that's an appropriate policy for the NIH to refuse to give members of Congress the debate over whether something is or is not gain of function?
My general philosophy at NIH was to always be as cooperative with members of Congress as humanly possible.
Your boss, not so much. When he was for that when he wasn't busy taking down fellow scientific colleagues. Dr. Parker, do you think it's appropriate for the NIH to refuse to give Congress the minutes or deliberations over what is or what is not gain of function, particularly concerning research that was done in Wuhan?
Inappropriate.
Dr. Redfield, do you think the NIH should release, do you think it's inappropriate that they won't release, and should they release the information concerning the deliberations over gain of function?
Yeah, I think it's inappropriate that they don't share that information.
Dr. Esvelt, do you think it's inappropriate that the NIH continues to refuse to reveal information considering the deliberations over gain of function?
I think transparency is essential to public trust in science, and I think NIH has a duty to uphold public trust in science insofar as possible.
The public needs to realize that I only know of this meeting existing because of a Freedom of Information Act. The Senate, groups of senators, the ranking member of a committee, they will not reveal they even have the meeting, much less the minutes of the meeting. I can get more information from the CIA than the NIH. Dr. Redfield, do you think that damages science when the science are acting like the CIA and not revealing information? Does it damage our trust in science?
I think it's going to be very hard for public trust to be regained, at NIH, CDC, FDA, from what we experienced in the COVID pandemic.
Dr. Redfield, do you think, we talked a little bit about this before, but taking the backbone of a SARS virus and adding various S proteins from other unknown viruses to see what you get, running through that through serial passage. Should that have gone before some sort of gain of function review, even if it, to figure out whether it meets a definition of dangerous research?
Yes.
One of Anthony Fauci's responses has been, well, they're two animal viruses and we don't know that they will infect humans. But by the time you combine them, the test they do is they actually test them to see if they infect human cells after they're done manipulating them. So their goal really is to see, hey guys, do you think we can make it more infectious? And yet they say, and they hide behind definitions of, well, we didn't know in advance. And this becomes the problem. And look, I come from a scientific background. I'm aware of CRISPR technology, not enough to do it, but aware of the great benefits of science. I'm aware of creating bacteria that make insulin. Not against any of those kind of things. But I do want scientists like yourselves to be on some sort of committee to overlook this. But I get the feeling that over and over again, this has been hidden and been in-house. There was actually, and I'm trying to remember if it's the same board that you led, Dr. Parker, but it's the NAA, remind me the acronym for your board?
NSABB.
And you're still ahead of it.
I'm still a member of the committee, but any of my comments today are not reflective. They're on my.
And I won't put you on the spot on this, but there's a story from like 4, 8, 10 years ago of like a whole bunch of people being fired by Dr. Fauci because they disagreed with his opinion on gain of function. And so that it's just another indication that we can't have this all within house and it's like, oh, no big deal. There really has to be some independent people outside of government to look at that. And that's what I emphasize over and over is that we have to get to some sort of independent board here. Dr. Wolanich, you were a member of the PC 3O committee, correct?
That's correct.
Who were the other members?
I don't recall all of them off the top of my head. There were about a dozen. I know there were representatives from ASPR, from the communications, Bill Hall at HHS. It's been a while.
Are you aware that they were also refusing to give us the names? I think the names have been published by the COVID committee. They've been refusing to give the names of the people on the COVID committee. I mean, on the.
As a member of the committee, previous member of the committee, I have no objection to the names being released.
But you can see the problem. So you set up an oversight committee, but the oversight committee never saw the Wuhan research. Should the Wuhan research, taking a SARS backbone and putting a new S protein on it and running through human cells to see if it infects, and then it turns out it did, and then we say, oh, it's only 1,000 times more, and we'll give you more leeway to do it, et cetera, all the stuff that happened with EcoHealth. In retrospect, should that have gone before the P3CO committee?
So, Senator Paul, I think one of the things I've learned in engaging this, particularly as a non-virologist myself, although I'm a scientist, I don't know that much about virology, is that it's really important to have expertise to be able to evaluate that benefit and risk and talk about whether or not it meets the scopes of these policies. However, I do agree that, and I'm glad we're discussing whether or not there is an opportunity to do this better, to introduce independence earlier in the process.
That's a general answer, and that's fine. But very specifically, should the research putting in a new S protein, a random S protein from a random unknown virus on a SARS backbone, creating an infectious chimera, and then deciding or looking to see if it infects human cells more, should that have gone before the P3CO committee, yes or no?
I do not know enough about the research to be able to make that. That was why I was not part of the process
That's really disappointing, and I mean, would exclude me from considering you for any board, frankly, if you can't admit. I mean, because you're still in your mind thinking, oh, I don't want to criticize Francis Collins, or I don't want to criticize Anthony Fauci because this is your group, you know. But in retrospect, 15 million people died. The Department of Energy have concluded it came from the lab. So is the FBI. So did the CIA until higher-ups at the CIA told them to change their opinion. But the group of scientists at the CIA, according to a whistleblower, voted 6-1. Look at what we're faced with. And people wonder about vaccine hesitancy or hesitancy of science. If you look at the information, for example, one of the strongest circumstantial evidence that they may have done this in the lab and that the furin cleavage site may have been added is the fact that in 2018, Dr. Shi and Dr. Barrett presented something called the diffuse proposal. Are you aware of the diffuse proposal?
I've read about it in the news, but I was not aware about it contemporaneously.
Contemporaneously, you weren't aware of it?
No, I'd never heard of it.
And here's the thing. Do you know how I'm aware of it? The NIH didn't tell me. The HHS didn't tell me. No one in government told me. A colonel in the Marines who worked for DARPA told me, under the protection of the whistleblower statute. In our government, we're concerned the Chinese lied to us and that they are distrustful, which is probably true. But in our government, you know, you may not have liked the tone of the other senators, but this is what we're faced with. The diffuse proposal was never told to us. In the diffuse proposal, it was a proposal to take a coronavirus, put a furin cleavage site in it, and test it to see if it was more infectious in humans. What did COVID-19 turn out to be? A very unusual, if not the first sarbecovirus in a family of viruses to have a furin cleavage site. It's why alarm bells went off and all of Anthony Fauci's cronies that were all saying it came from the lab, it looks like it was engineered, until they were convinced somehow within days to write the proximal origin paper saying it wasn't and calling everybody crazy and a conspiracy theorist and calling Facebook and everybody else and saying, take down, don't give any credence to these people. So you see what has happened to science. Francis Collins, your boss, at one point says, it's about, you know, damage to science. If anybody mentions that this might have come from a lab, it will damage science. Other people were saying it will damage our relations with China. So the truth wasn't so important. It was the business of science, the billions of dollars changing hand. And you and your boss, I mean, this whole cabal has created such damage to science in this, and it continues to this day. They will not give me the deliberations. We're not talking about secrets. We're not talking about informants. We're not talking about spies. I'm talking about scientists in my own government. Will not give me the deliberations on whether or not the research in Wuhan was. You still to this day won't admit it, even though the Department of Energy, FBI, and maybe as much as half of the scientific community are convinced it came from the lab. Even some might say it's 5% chance it came from the lab, and yet you won't admit that it's dangerous research. To this day, you will still sit there and say you're unable to judge whether the research going on in Wuhan was dangerous.
Senator Paul, I will say that the origin of the COVID-19 pandemic is unknown. When I was in the government, I had a high level of clearance and received the intelligence briefings to which you are referring. And my general conclusion is that there was a lack of consensus among analysts across the federal government. It was not as cut and dried as you are making it sound. I cannot speak to the innermost thoughts of anyone at NIH, but I will say in my personal experience, I never knew any of the scientists at NIH to be anything but open-minded because they thought that the information was power in being able to develop the diagnostics, treatments, and countermeasures, as well as future policies to help both address the COVID-19 pandemic and respond to future pandemics.
Dr. Wollenitz, have you visited the Rocky Mountain Lab?
No, I've never been there.
Were you aware of that the proposal to do the diffuse project involved laboratory work that was to be done at the Rocky Mountain Lab?
No, as I said, I was not aware of the diffuse proposal.
Okay. Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Senator Paul. Dr. Wollenitz, as you said earlier, you were part of the P3CO team, review team. Who decided that EcoHealth's project should not go to the P3CO team?
Decisions about whether or not proposals met the scope of the P3CO policy and were referred to HHS were done at the cognizant funding level. So in that case, it would have been NIAID.
So Dr. Fauci would have had direct control of whether that project, that study should have went to EcoHealth?
It was more likely done at the staff level, but yes.
Would you agree with me that once research goes to China with American dollars, that NIH has zero control over the safety of that research?
No, I would not agree with that. I think it is really important to make sure that we put the proper terms and conditions in place on any federal award, particularly to a foreign entity, and all of the processes that meet those, whether it's the ability to inspect or require records.
So if you have faith in what's in our research, American dollars research in China, what is the NIH process for tracking research in China? And recall, regarding the transparency of this, recall that EcoHealth did not report its subcontract with the WIV to the public record database as well. So you're telling me, you sitting here, you're telling me you have faith that the NIH is appropriately supervising, making sure that the research done there is safe?
I think that if there is any evidence, as I believe there has been in the case of this particular lab, that they are not following procedures, there should be corrective action up to and including debarments for an institution if there's any evidence that they are not following the terms and conditions of their
Did
award.
NIH have any responsibility in ensuring they were following safety procedures, even doing the right research in the right biosecurity level lab?
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is a ripe area for the committee to think about strengthening the biosafety system. Right now, our biosafety system very much depends on guidelines and professional judgments. I think there is more we can do in terms of adopting standards and norms that provide systems of accountability so that we can be assured that the highest levels and practices in biosafety are happening.
In light of EcoHealth's research project concealments, including late reports and misrepresentations, and in light of NIH being surprised that Boston University conducted gain-of-function research with monkeypox virus fairly recently, has NIH undertaken a full review of its research to identify gain-of-function projects? And if not, why not?
I cannot speak for NIH, sir. I have not worked there for more than a year.
Were you aware of any type of improvement, full review of these research projects then before your departure?
These projects, could you be more specific? I was not aware of a sort of overarching review of projects.
Was this monkeypox virus before or after you left? I don't recall.
I do not recall hearing about it before I left, so I'm guessing the concerns were raised after.
Are you aware of any training that the NIH does, requires its researchers and grant recipients about the Bioweapons Convention Act and China's refusal to certify that they do not operate an active bioweapons program?
No, I've actually long been a proponent for including BWTC training and biosecurity and biosafety awareness training for scientists in general. I think that we should have the resources and tools to be able to do that.
Between January 1st, 2020, and the publication of the Proximal Origins articles, were you aware of Dr. Collins having any direct communications with the authors of that article, either through email or through phone call?
Yes, I was aware those discussions were underway. I was not directly involved in any of them.
Would you describe his conversations with them? Was it one or two? Were there many conversations? Was it mostly on the phone? Was it part of conference calls? Were minutes kept?
I do not recall the number of those meetings, sir. And I do not believe that there were minutes kept, because my impression was these were informal conversations between scientists, not part of a formal committee process.
Is that standard government procedure that they should be informal?
Conversations between scientists about science are frequent at research agencies across the federal government, and depending on the context, are often informal discussions. For example, program officers talk with scientists that they work with on a pretty regular basis about the progress for science, future science ideas, and those conversations are usually
From January
informal.
1st of 2020 and over the first 3 or 4 months of this pandemic, was there any type of national security officers, people from in the national security programs in advising Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins?
As I recall, sir, I mean, in general, when there's an outbreak of an infectious disease, the National Security Council has the lead and runs points on the interagency
I understand that, but
policy
were they in there
process.
communicating with your people?
Oh, yes, certainly. I think at many levels, people across NIH were participating in those interagency policy conversations.
We're going to conclude very quickly. I just wanted to put into evidence for the committee hearing today. This is an email from June 17th, 2016, and it's from the weekly dual-use research of concern gain-of-function meeting. It sounds like all within NIAID. And the discussion was DASAX RO1/MERS/ERIC is the description. We were also, through Freedom of Information, nothing's been volunteered to us, but this is what we got as far as the deliberations. And it's insulting, not only to us, but really we represent, the people of the country. And look, 15 million people died. And the NIH won't give us the information on how the decision was made, that was fine research to do. This is incredibly galling. I hope this hearing is a way of bringing at least some of us together, that there has to be something done. I think there has been a consensus that there ought to be an independent board. We're very open. There is nothing set in stone. We put forward together the ideas in the bill. Almost every idea in the bill is from scientists. We're more than happy to hear more scientists. I want to get a result. I want an independent commission. I think it needs to be outside of NIH. And I think there's a possibility. So any scientists here or any scientists listening, we are very open to it. We don't want to exclude good research. This could be as many as 20 projects. It could be 100 projects. I don't know how many it is a year out of the tens of thousands of projects. But there ought to be a discussion whether or not, putting an S protein from a coronavirus on a SARS backbone is dangerous or not. And we ought to be able to come to an agreement. I think rational minds could. The hearing today, the record will remain open for 15 days until July 26th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. The hearing is adjourned. Thank you very much.
So I was going to provide a little bit of analysis. I mean, this is a little bit of kind of the slow. We've gotten the slow roll or the discovery process throughout this whole thing, right? We had a Fauci hearing. Was it last month? Not a lot came out as far. He was dodging responsibility. This was more about this is about the funding, technically, the funding of the research, and it's different. These Senate hearings are very different from the House hearings because the Senate is controlled by Democrats, so they schedule the hearings, they schedule the witnesses. Redfield was here. He was good. So was the other guy. He was okay. Yeah, the guy from MIT. And the lady was obviously, I think, it's safe to say she was probably invited by the Democrats. And this was a shocker, too. I mean, a big part of my analysis, for this hearing is that only 2 Democrats showed up, and they are a majority. They're in a majority in the Senate. And it's almost unacceptable, in my opinion, right? Because, the way it should go is if you're in the majority, you should be in control of the time. You should be asking the most questions. And you'd think by watching this hearing that the Republicans were in the majority because it was just Republican question. Only, was it Rosen showed up and the chairman? I think he has to show up to some degree, right? Peters. So that's the biggest shocking moment. Johnson's graphs are always elucidating. I'm going to clip that for sure. Rand Paul, as usual, is, you don't see him reading off of, I know he's not a Democrat, but DNC talking points memo is what I always think of when you see, a Democrat who doesn't have anything to say for themselves, but they are just reading off of whatever they got from the party. That is not Dr. Rand Paul. He is locked in. He knows all the facts. I don't know if he has perfect recall or whatever it is. It's insane. I'm going to have to rewatch him because he's so technical. Hey, Pizza Duder, what's up, man? And he's so I'm going to rewatch Paul. Hawley was definitely, I think, the most intense, right? He has that cross-examination muscle that's just strong with Hawley. So Hawley, we had the best cross from, and then Paul, most technical, and then Johnson had the graph, which was, like I said, it breaks down a lot of information very quickly for you. And it was very disturbing, how quickly the shot, let's call it, was able to rack up a bunch of these adverse events and even deaths. Where we're looking at the other stuff, it was like 50 years, and they had a few thousand deaths attributed to them. But, if this had gone out for 50 years, it would have been devastating. Like social engineering level, maybe it even is at the level that it's at. So, I see a lot of comments like, what is this? What are we doing? It's a very slow process, right? I forget, it drags on slowly. The wheels of justice grind slowly. And there's, more to that turn of phrase. But with that said, I'm glad everybody was able to join me. Let me just briefly look at the chat, see if I missed anything. Yes, thank you. I love everybody, by the way. Happy Monday. Pizza Duder again. Rand Paul's great. Hawley's intense. Agreed, 100%. Yeah. So that's my take. My take is, they obviously the democratically the witnesses called by the Dems were all about, we need more money if we want the kind of oversight that we're talking about. The one guy from MIT is like, I don't want the oversight, but we need the oversight, which was good to hear. And Redfield was, seems to be like the real witness that I was waiting for, where we actually got some of the, we got information that wasn't necessarily out there before. I don't know. Yeah, it's good to hear someone who was the former CDC director say it's going to take a lot of time. A lot of trust was lost. If it's ever be able to be regained by the CDC and the NIH, who knows? So that needed to be said by somebody. Yes, the wheels of justice, Brandy. All right, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and I'll put some clips out later. And, oh, gosh. Before I jet, I just wanted to say, thank you to everybody. I'm glad everybody's okay. Cheryl, I'm not sure if you're still here. She was at the rally over the weekend, and I'm glad that she's okay. We, someone in the audience, a firefighter, volunteer firefighter. I'm not sure if he's a volunteer or he's a full-fledged firefighter, but he was protecting his family, and he passed away. Terrible. But everything I've seen about Trump, he's getting better, stronger. His numbers are good. I don't know. I woke up Sunday morning still in shock a little bit. So, that hearing is going to be on the 22nd. The attempted assassination oversight hearing of the Secret Service should be on the 22nd. Keep an eye out for that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mark, for subscribing. I'll see you all very soon. And keep an eye out for the live streams this week. And be well. Knowledge is power. Subscribe for more. Take care.